The morning sun cast long shadows across the bridge of the carrier Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo studied the vast Pacific horizon. It was June 4th, 1942, and the most powerful naval armada Japan had ever assembled was bearing down on a tiny coral atoll called Midway. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers cut through the azure waters with deadly purpose. Nagumo's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but beneath his stoic exterior burned the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. 6 months earlier, this same fleet had delivered the crushing blow at Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war. Now Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of that surprise attack, had conceived an even bolder plan. Midway would be the bait that would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers and experience would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The small American garrison on Midway would be crushed, and the atoll would become Japan's westernmost outpost, a dagger pointed at Hawaii itself. Below deck, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, prepared his pilots for what he believed would be another triumphant morning. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers were being armed and fueled, their crews eager to add another victory to their impressive record. These were the same airmen who had sunk battleships at Pearl Harbor, devastated the British fleet in the Indian Ocean, and conquered the Dutch East Indies. They considered themselves invincible, and their track record seemed to prove it. Yamamoto himself commanded the operation from his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, positioning himself 300 miles behind the carrier force. His plan was intricate and multi-layered. While Nagumo's carriers attacked Midway, a separate force would simultaneously assault the Aleutian Islands, dividing American attention and resources. Once Midway fell, and the American fleet emerged to reclaim it, Yamamoto's battleships would close the trap in a decisive surface engagement that would end American naval power in the Pacific forever. The Japanese intelligence report suggested only 2 American carriers remained operational in the Pacific. The Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier and was presumably still under repair. Enterprise and Hornet were somewhere in the vast ocean, but Japanese reconnaissance had failed to locate them. This uncertainty should have troubled Nagumo, but success had bred overconfidence. Japan had won every major engagement since the war began, and there seemed no reason this should be different. As dawn broke over the Pacific, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind and began launching their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft roared off the flight decks, their engines creating a thunderous symphony of impending destruction. The pilots were veterans of dozens of successful missions, their aircraft the finest carrier-based planes in the world. Everything seemed to favor Japanese victory. Yet unknown to Nagumo and his confident airmen, American codebreakers had already unraveled Yamamoto's elaborate plan. 3 American carriers, not 2, were racing toward an intercept course. The trap that Japan had so carefully laid was about to become their own snare, and the gamble that had seemed so certain would prove to be the beginning of their irreversible decline. 3,000 miles away from Nagumo's advancing fleet, in the basement of a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. His team of cryptanalysts had been working around the clock for weeks, their eyes bloodshot from strain, their minds racing to crack the enemy's most closely guarded secrets. What they discovered would change the course of the Pacific War. The Tiate, Japanese naval code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence, had been partially broken months earlier. Rochefort's team could decipher approximately 60% of intercepted messages, enough to piece together the broad outlines of enemy plans, but not always the crucial details. The breakthrough came when they noticed repeated references to a target designated AF in Japanese communications. Rochefort suspected AF meant Midway, but Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty before committing his precious remaining carriers to battle. Rochefort devised a brilliant deception. He ordered the garrison on Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. Within days, Japanese radio intercepts mentioned that AF was experiencing water supply problems. The trap had worked perfectly. AF was definitely Midway, and Rochefort now knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Nimitz made the most crucial decision of his career, despite having only 3 operational carriers against Japan's 4. He would attempt to ambush the Japanese fleet. The damaged Yorktown was rushed through repairs at Pearl Harbor in an impossible 72 hours. Workers labored day and night, welding steel plates over bomb damage and patching the flight deck that had been torn apart at Coral Sea. According to historical accounts documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval histories, many believed the ship needed months of repair work, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown, would command the American task force. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, would coordinate the attack. These men faced a daunting challenge. Not only were they outnumbered, but they were also sailing into battle against the most experienced carrier force in the world. The Japanese had been fighting for 6 months and had never lost a major engagement. Their pilots were veterans of dozens of successful missions, while many American airmen were still inexperienced newcomers to carrier warfare. The American plan was brutally simple. Using their intelligence advantage, they would position themselves northeast of Midway and wait for the Japanese carriers to commit themselves to attacking the atoll. While Japanese aircraft were over Midway, bombing the island's installations, American dive bombers would catch the enemy carriers with their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. It was a plan that required perfect timing and considerable luck. On June 3, 1942, the American carriers reached their designated positions. Fletcher and Spruance maintained radio silence, their ships hidden beneath cloud cover as they waited for the Japanese fleet to appear. Below decks, American pilots studied recognition charts and planned their attacks. Many were young men barely out of flight training, facing combat for the first time against enemies who had dominated every battle since Pearl Harbor. The stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. On one side, the confident Japanese, approaching what they believed would be another easy victory. On the other, the outnumbered Americans, armed with superior intelligence and desperate determination. Neither side fully understood how completely the next 24 hours would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific, but the codebreakers had already tilted the scales in America's favor. At 0430 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 Japanese aircraft off the decks of Nagumo's carriers toward Midway Atoll. The pre-dawn darkness was pierced by the blue flames of aircraft exhausts as bombers and fighters formed up for their attack. Tominaga, a veteran pilot with years of combat experience, felt confident as he guided his formation southward. Intelligence reports suggested Midway's defenses were minimal, and this first strike should neutralize the American base with little difficulty. What Tominaga encountered over Midway shattered Japanese assumptions about American preparedness. The atoll bristled with anti-aircraft guns, and Marine fighters rose to meet the attackers with desperate fury. Major Floyd Parks led 26 Marine Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters in a suicidal charge against the superior Japanese Zeros. Obsolete American fighters were slaughtered, but their sacrifice bought precious time for the ground defenses to prepare. Despite fierce resistance, Tominaga's bombers successfully attacked Midway's airfields, fuel tanks, and installations. However, as he circled the smoking atoll to assess the damage, the experienced pilot realized one crucial fact: a second strike would be necessary. The runway was still operational, and many installations remained intact. At 0700 hours, Tominaga radioed back to Nagumo with the message that would seal Japan's fate. Second attack necessary. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his naval career. His aircraft were returning from the Midway strike, their fuel running low, and several damaged by American defensive fire. On the hangar decks below, a second wave of planes waited, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended for use against American warships. Tominaga's message meant these weapons would need to be removed and replaced with high-explosive bombs, suitable for attacking land targets. At 07:15, Nagumo made his fatal choice. He ordered the rearming of his second-wave aircraft for another strike against Midway. In the cramped hangar decks of 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of aviation ordnance men began the dangerous process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive ordnance. The removed weapons were stacked carelessly around the hangar decks, creating potential infernos if struck by enemy fire. Just as this rearming process began, Nagumo received a radio message that changed everything. At 07:28, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported, 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The message was incomplete and maddeningly vague. Were these ships carriers or merely cruisers and destroyers? The scout pilot had failed to identify the vessel types, leaving Nagumo to guess whether he faced a minor threat or the entire American Pacific Fleet. Nagumo hesitated. Should he continue rearming for the second Midway strike, or should he prepare for naval combat? At 07:45, he sent an urgent message to the scout plane. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. The precious minutes ticked by as ordnance crews continued their dangerous work. Bombs and torpedoes scattered across hangar decks, while Nagumo waited for clarification. Finally, at 08:20, the scout plane reported the devastating news. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's blood ran cold. American carriers meant American aircraft, and those aircraft could be approaching his fleet at this very moment. He immediately ordered all rearming operations to halt and reversed his previous command. The second wave would be rearmed again, this time with anti-ship weapons. The delay would prove catastrophic. By the time Nagumo received confirmation of American carriers, his hangar decks were chaos. Bombs, torpedoes, aviation fuel, and ammunition were scattered everywhere as ordnance crews desperately tried to rearm aircraft for the third time in 4 hours. The carriers that had seemed invincible that morning had become floating powder kegs, and American dive bombers were already on their way. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber as he led 37 aircraft from the Enterprise high above the empty Pacific Ocean. It was 09:20 on June 4th, and his fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. For over an hour, he had been searching for the Japanese fleet, following the course projected by American intelligence. But the ocean below remained stubbornly empty, and McCluskey faced the agonizing decision that had destroyed many promising military careers. Should he continue the search or return to his carrier before his fuel ran out completely? The morning had begun with disaster for American naval aviation. The first attacks against the Japanese fleet had been piecemeal and catastrophic. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet had found the enemy carriers first, but their obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were slaughtered by Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Of 15 aircraft that attacked, only 1 survived, and Ensign George Gay would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. The torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered similar fates, losing nearly every aircraft without scoring a single hit. McCluskey's dive bombers had missed the Japanese fleet entirely, following an incorrect heading that led them far to the south of their targets. Now, with fuel running critically low, McCluskey made the decision that would change history. Instead of turning back toward Enterprise, he continued searching, reasoning that the Japanese carriers had to be somewhere in the area. At 09:55, his persistence was rewarded. A lone Japanese destroyer, racing northward at maximum speed, appeared in his binoculars. The destroyer was the Arashi, returning to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. McCluskey realized the ship was heading directly toward the Japanese carriers, providing him with a perfect heading to follow. At 10:22, the horizon ahead filled with ships. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. McCluskey had found Admiral Nagumo's mobile force at the worst possible moment for the Japanese. Below on the carrier decks, chaos reigned. The repeated rearming operations had left hangar decks cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and ammunition. Bombs and torpedoes sat unguarded on flight decks, as crews desperately tried to prepare aircraft for launch. The morning's air operations had left the carrier's fighter cover depleted, with most Zeros either refueling or flying at low altitude after engaging American torpedo bombers. The Japanese fleet's anti-aircraft defenses were focused downward, watching for more torpedo attacks from sea level. McCluskey's attack achieved complete surprise. Diving from 14,000 feet, his dauntless bombers screamed down toward the helpless carriers with their air raid sirens wailing. The Japanese crews looked up in horror as American aircraft materialized from the clear blue sky like avenging angels. At exactly 10:26, McCluskey rolled into his dive against the carrier Kaga, his aircraft's perforated dive brakes extending to control his descent speed. The attack lasted only 6 minutes, but those 6 minutes decided the fate of the Pacific War. McCluskey's dive bombers struck Kaga with 4 direct hits, turning the carrier into a blazing inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led dive bombers from Yorktown against the Soryu, scoring 3 direct hits that doomed the carrier within minutes. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was struck by a single bomb that detonated among aircraft being rearmed on the flight deck, creating a chain reaction of explosions that gutted the ship. In 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded, their flight decks blown apart, and their hangar decks consumed by fires fed by aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. The gamble that had seemed so certain that morning had become a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship burning around him, transferred to a cruiser and watched in stunned disbelief as the backbone of Japanese naval aviation went up in flames. Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, watching black smoke pour from his burning sister ships on the southern horizon. Unlike the other 3 carriers in Nagumo's force, Hiryu had been operating separately and had escaped the devastating American dive bomber attack that had crippled Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Now she was the sole surviving Japanese carrier, her flight deck crowded with the remnants of what had been the most powerful carrier force in the world just hours earlier. Yamaguchi was cut from different cloth than most Japanese naval officers. A progressive thinker who had opposed the attack on Pearl Harbor, he nevertheless fought with fierce determination once war had begun. Now, faced with the destruction of 3/4 of his force, he made a decision that epitomized the Japanese warrior spirit. Hiryu would continue fighting alone. At 1100 hours, he ordered Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi to lead 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters in a retaliatory strike against the American carriers. The attack found the Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, recovering aircraft from the morning's successful strikes. Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson led the carrier's fighter defenses against Kobayashi's bombers, but several Japanese aircraft broke through the defensive screen. 3 bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating deep into the ship's interior and starting serious fires. The carrier's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties fought to save the ship. Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1300 hours, he launched a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga's fuel tank had been holed by anti-aircraft fire during the earlier mission, but he volunteered to lead this desperate attack, knowing he would not have enough fuel to return. It was a suicide mission in all but name. Tominaga's torpedo bombers found Yorktown dead in the water, her crew working frantically to repair the damage from the earlier attack. The obsolete American TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that had been slaughtered earlier that morning had taught the Japanese pilots exactly how to conduct a torpedo attack against a stationary carrier. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that made flight operations impossible. Admiral Fletcher was forced to abandon his flagship and transfer to a cruiser, but Yamaguchi's defiance would not go unanswered. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American task force from Enterprise, had been tracking Hiryu throughout the afternoon. At 1530, he launched 24 dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher to eliminate the last Japanese carrier. The attack group also included 10 dive bombers from the crippled Yorktown, their pilots determined to avenge their ship. The American dive bombers found Hiryu at 1700 hours, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for a third strike. Like her sister ships that morning, Hiryu was caught at the worst possible moment. Gallagher's bombers achieved complete surprise, diving out of the setting sun to deliver 4 direct hits on the carrier's flight deck and hangar. The bombs detonated among fueled and armed aircraft, creating the same devastating chain reaction that had destroyed the other Japanese carriers. Captain Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship, choosing instead to go down with Hiryu in the tradition of Bushido. As flames consumed his carrier, he gathered his surviving officers on the bridge and spoke of the honor they had brought to the Imperial Navy. When Hiryu finally slipped beneath the Pacific waves at 0910 the following morning, Yamaguchi was still aboard, standing at attention on the bridge as his ship died around him. With Hiryu's destruction, Japan had lost all 4 fleet carriers of the Mobile Force, along with over 300 aircraft and many of their most experienced pilots. The morning's confident advance toward Midway had become an unmitigated disaster. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the catastrophe from his flagship Yamato, made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and order a general retreat. The gamble that was supposed to deliver decisive victory had instead handed Japan its first major defeat of the Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of the battleship Yamato as reports of the disaster continued to pour in throughout the night of June 4th to 5th, 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year, watched his predictions come to pass with devastating accuracy. The 6 months were up, and the tide of war had turned irreversibly against Japan. The losses were catastrophic beyond imagination. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, lay on the bottom of the Pacific. With them had gone over 300 aircraft and, more critically, many of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. These were not replacements that could be quickly trained and equipped. The veteran aviators who had conquered Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean were irreplaceable assets. Their years of training and combat experience lost forever in a single day's fighting. Yamamoto understood the strategic implications better than anyone in the Japanese high command. Japan's industrial capacity could build new carriers and manufacture new aircraft, but the nation lacked the resources and time to train replacement pilots to the same standard. American industrial might, now fully mobilized for war, would produce carriers and aircraft in numbers that Japan could never match. The carefully cultivated advantage in naval aviation that had made Japanese expansion possible was gone forever. The immediate tactical situation was equally grim. Dawn on June 5th revealed the burning hulk of Yorktown still afloat but abandoned, her crew rescued by American destroyers. Japanese submarines would later sink the crippled carrier, but this small victory could not mask the magnitude of the defeat. Admiral Nagumo, transferred from his burning flagship to the cruiser Nagara, was a broken man, his confidence shattered by the disaster that had befallen his supposedly invincible force. Yamamoto faced a terrible choice. His battle fleet, led by the massive Yamato, still possessed overwhelming firepower. The American carriers, having expended most of their aircraft in the day's attacks, were vulnerable to surface action. A night engagement might salvage something from the disaster, perhaps sinking 1 or more American flat tops in revenge for the lost Japanese carriers. But such an attack would require bringing his battleships within range of American land-based aircraft operating from Midway, and the atoll's defenses had proven far stronger than intelligence had suggested. More fundamentally, Yamamoto realized that continuing the operation served no strategic purpose. Even if he sank every remaining American carrier, Japan lacked the forces to occupy and hold Midway. The transport ships carrying the invasion force were already turning back toward Japan, their mission canceled when the covering carriers were destroyed. Without control of the air, no amphibious operation could succeed, and Japan no longer possessed naval aviation superiority in the Central Pacific. At 0255 on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Retire northward, IRE. The combined fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, began its withdrawal from waters it would never again approach with confidence. The gamble that was supposed to crush American naval power and secure Japanese dominance had instead handed the United States the initiative that it would never relinquish. The Battle of Midway's consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was shattered. American morale, battered by 6 months of defeats, soared with news of the victory. More importantly, the loss of experienced aircrew began Japan's inevitable decline in pilot quality, while American pilot training programs expanded dramatically to supply the new carriers already under construction in American shipyards. As Yamato's massive screws churned the Pacific waters, carrying Yamamoto away from his greatest defeat, the admiral who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor understood that he had witnessed the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's 6 months of running wild were over, and the long, inevitable retreat toward the home islands had begun. The gamble for Midway had indeed yielded irreversible loss, and the consequences would echo across the Pacific until Japan's final surrender 3 years later.